You're watching JoCo in the Know, a public service program co-sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Johnson County and Johnson County Community College.
Good evening and welcome to this election almost eve version of JoCo in the Know, brought to you by the League of Women Voters in Johnson County Community College. I'm Dave Helling with the Kansas City Star, and tonight as we get ready for the election, about a month away as we tape this program, we'll be talking with some leading lawmakers and others who observe the process about the issues facing Kansas and some of the things that you might want to keep in mind as you head to the voting booth on November 6th or earlier if you choose to vote that way. Let's introduce you to the panel. We've got three great guests here tonight and we're going to have a great discussion. Let's start with former Senator Tim Owens and then we'll go around the table. Tim, introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your legislative history or where you're at now in the political world.
Well, I'm Tim Owens and I retired October 1st from the Kansas Senate, Republican member of the Senate, and I served in the Senate for 4 years, and prior to that I was a member of the House of Representatives in Kansas for 7 years. And prior to that I was a longtime city council member in Overland Park. So I had about 31 years of government service in this local area representing the people in Overland Park.
Pretty good start. Tim, Gene?
Yeah, I'm Gene Rardin. I'm a former representative, first elected in 2006. Served 2 terms in the Kansas State House and ran in 2010 and didn't win. And since that time I've been still involved in politics, but not in a formal type of role. And I've been a teacher, I've been an electrical engineer, I've been a small business person, so I've had quite a varied background.
And now you're a TV star. Rob?
Rob Hodgkinson. I'm the former state chair for the Libertarian Party of Kansas from 2005 to 2009. I'm a small business owner here in town as well. I've participated with Ron Thornburg with a study group back in 2009 about the future of elections in Kansas. So it's a subject that I think I've got some background on with
Great, and
those kind of things.
We'll want to get to that, Rob, obviously, because we do want to give some of our viewers some indication of what they can expect when they go to the polls this year. It's going to be a bit different, will it not, than it's been in previous years in terms of what you have to present and how you're going to cast your ballot.
I haven't done specific details, but yeah.
We'll
yes.
come back to that in a little
Yes.
bit. But first, let's talk a little bit about the legislative session. Last time we were here, Tim, as you know, we talked about what the legislature had wrought. Now that some time has passed, elections have been held, primary elections. Give me some sense in your view, and we'll ask our other panelists to talk about this too, what Kansas has in store for itself next year, other than significant change. It's very clear that there's going to be massive turnover at the legislative level. What does that mean in your view for Kansas?
Well, I think that the changes that were made in the primary elections, a number of the moderate Republicans, me included, were voted out and replaced with conservatives who were very strongly supported by the governor and the governor's team on a number of issues. I think that there is going to be a strong effort to make headway into some bills and some issues that the governor's wanted and hasn't been able to get through the last 2 years. So I think we'll see some real efforts in the areas of judicial selection, in the areas of education, in the area of taxation. The tax bill, as we discussed I think the last time I was here, is a pretty egregious thing that needs to be repaired, and it's going to be interesting to see how a much more conservative Kansas Senate and House will in fact deal with that issue.
Well, I want to come back to the issues specifically in a minute, but having served, Gene, what does it mean when you, just as a practical matter, when you have the kind of turnover we're going to have? I mean, by some estimates, a third of the legislature may have never served in the legislature before because of redistricting and some of the changes. I mean, there's some people suggesting 60, 70 new House members. What does that mean for governance in your view, having that many sort of freshmen in the mix?
Well, it's going to definitely be difficult for the new people coming in to adjust when there are no experienced role models there in some of the key
Why is that?
positions.
Explain why that would be. Is it because they don't understand how the legislature works, or is it because maybe the freshmen won't be as quite familiar with the issues as people who've been around for a while, or is it a combination
Well,
of
I
the
think
two?
it'll be both, because I found my time in the State House to be a very great learning experience, both about the legislative operations, but also about the issues, because you have to become very familiar with the key issues
Pretty
having to
quickly.
do with your particular committees. I was on the tax committee,
Right.
and
And some issues are very, I
yeah.
mean, I think people aren't quite aware of this, could be very arcane. I mean, they're very deep, very, particularly taxation, very intricate. It isn't, you know, should taxes go up or down, but the language and how it's, you know, and the information you get. Talk about that a little bit. That's going to be a bit of a steep curve for some of the freshmen as well.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, we have an excellent legislative research department, which can really be a great assistance to the members of the legislature if they will take advantage of that resource. And hopefully they will, because there's so much that you can learn that way.
Yeah.
But it also helps to talk to other fellow legislators, and you do have to depend on the experienced legislators to provide you with the information you need to make decisions, and you develop a trust really for the people in your caucus, your Democratic or Republican caucus.
But do you share this view, Rob, that there's a steep learning curve for lawmakers? And if so, isn't that a recipe for a Governor Sam Brownback to really have more influence earlier than you would if you had an experienced legislature? I mean, the whole point is that they can sort of do things because the freshmen may not be ready for it.
Right, and as kind of an outsider looking in on this one, I think what we're going to have is that with that many freshmen, you get less compromise. I think they're going to come in hot. Oh, I just got elected.
Really?
I'm going to. There's going to be less compromise. They're going to want to dig their heels in a little bit more to make things happen. However, I think, as Tim kind of noted earlier, it's going to be. I think the House, the Senate, and the governor is going to be very conservative. I don't think there's going to need to be, people that do dig their heels in are just going to get walked on. I think there's going to be enough majorities now for the conservatives this next session. They're going to walk on everything. And it's so coming in, that learning curve I don't think is going to be quite so important. These conservatives that are coming in, I think, are going to follow Brownback anyway. I think that
Right.
was their design. And so
Well, and he was heavily involved.
That's going to happen.
And his people were heavily involved in, of course, recruiting many of these lawmakers. So there is some expectation that.
Yes.
So the idea, Gene and Tim, you could talk about this too. So the idea of the legislature as a check, we all learn in 7th grade checks and balances. The idea of the legislature as a check on the executive seems to be under some pressure, or will be in 2013. Do you think that's true? And we'll talk to Tim, but Gene, do you think that's true too?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. The House of Representatives has been highly
partisan.
controlled by the Republican Party. I think there were
Right.
92 members out of 125. So therefore, and they may lose some seats, but they'll still have a strong majority probably. The Senate was a different animal because of the presence of the combination of some moderate Republicans and Democrats, and that was able to actually provide some sort of a check on some of the things that were proposed by the governor and
Tim,
others.
you were in that group and aren't any longer. I will tell you that I went down for the Democratic National Convention in Charlotte and the Republican Convention in Tampa, and in both places you heard rather dire predictions about the Democrats' chances at all in the Senate. I mean, there's some suggestion they might have one seat when the election is over, maybe from Wyandotte County. That may be a little aggressive, but clearly this coalition that Gene talked about has vanished. What does that mean in your
Well,
opinion?
I think it's probably one of the biggest threats that we have facing the government in Kansas. And I say that advisedly. I'm very concerned. You know, I teach government here at Johnson County Community College, and I will tell you that I view what is happening, if that were to be the case after the November elections, as being virtually an elimination of the checks and balances within the government.
Agreed.
We'll have Sam Brownback, who in the executive branch, heading the executive branch, controlling much of what goes on in the legislature because of the numbers that will be there. I disagree with the figure of 1, but what is being looked at, I think the latest figures I've heard is a prediction of worst case scenario in the Senate, 4 Democrats, 4 moderate Republicans, maybe 5, and the remainder being conservative Republicans. If you have that kind of a situation and then you move over to the judicial selection issue where the governor is very adamant about changing the way we select select judges, that's going to be one of the first bills that comes out. And if he takes over control of who gets appointed to the court and eliminates the merit selection process, then you have all 3 branches under the control of one person. And I think that's a dangerous scenario.
Yeah. I'll come back to that. I actually was able to participate in a meeting, I think last week, with the Johnson County Bar Association and talked with some judges. They're quite worried about the judicial thing, but we'll come to that. But what about the people being a check on the executive and the legislative? I mean, you know, Sam Brownback will have to run presumably for re-election.
Correct.
Is it possible that he might overreach, that the voters might in essence be the
Yes.
check on the legislators in the next session?
Absolutely. I think you've seen that in Kansas over and over where, to use the Board of Education as a specific example, where the board became very conservative, like I expect most of government to be after this election in Topeka. After 2 years of that, the people jump up and vote, and they get upset and will get very active in the voting 2 years from now. Yeah, that could be a problem for Sam because as he's running for governor again, obviously as the incumbent, he's got a lot of benefits, a lot of things that can happen, but it could hurt him as well because all of this stuff is going to reflect directly on our governor, Brownback.
But now, Gene, maybe you could talk about this a little bit. My experience covering Kansas government has sort of reinforced what Rob is saying. If, and it's a big if voters sense a real personal connection to decisions made in Topeka that sort of affect their livelihoods. You know, you remember the big controversy over reappraisal and the whole problem with reassessments hurting Mike Hayden and some others. But you don't get the sense, I don't anyway, that people fully understand the impact of the Brownback changes in their own lives yet.
Yeah,
Is that right, do you think?
I think that's definitely the case. And can I go back just a minute to your estimate of 1 Senate member
from the
of
Democrats,
the Democratic
anyway.
Party? I think we have 3 strong candidates here in Johnson County: Lisa Johnston, Kyle Russell, and Juanita Roy for sure. And I think they all have chances of being elected, and that would help change.
I don't want to get too much into specific races,
I
obviously.
understand
since
that,
I'm
but
not
I
here,
just didn't want.
I get that.
I think that has been kind of a continuing narrative that there are no Democrats in Kansas, and I just wanted to raise a little bit of an objection to that.
But again, I get that. But talk again a little bit about this idea that the public, and I think this was reflected, Tim, in the primary to a degree, there is a sort of conceptual concern about the tax plan. There's a conceptual concern about school finance. There's a conceptual concern about property taxes and maybe even the judges. But it doesn't seem like the public feels that sort of concretely enough to affect the decisions they make. Am I missing something there or not?
I think that's partly true because I don't think some of the full effects of the changes, such as the $2.5 billion or $1 million tax billion,
$2.5 billion over several years,
tax
several years
hole that is created in the budget will necessarily make in the lives of our families regarding, for example, education, with K through 12 education being, I think, 53% of the state budget. It's going to have to be cut, or property taxes, the most hated tax of all, will have to be raised.
Right. But you don't get that pushback that Rob was talking about
it's not happening
unless
yet.
people open that envelope and go, wait a minute, what happened to my, or you know, their child comes home, there are 40 kids in my class now or whatever. And Tim, that was probably a problem in your race, wasn't it? That,
Well,
you know, saying to people, boy, this is going to be bad,
it was,
they don't feel that yet.
It was a
at the state
problem.
level.
It was a problem, but there's a bigger problem, I think, in the primaries, and that was the lack of voters turnout. In
But
my
why do you
district
think
alone.
that is? And Rob, I want you to talk about this too, obviously. Why do you think that is? It isn't as if we haven't covered this story in Kansas, or that people weren't talking about it, or that there wasn't a fairly clear delineation of who the moderates and liberals were for voters who cared to vote. But
No.
the turnout was horrible. And so you, again, this comes back to what I was just talking about in terms of people not feeling there's anything really at stake yet.
I think the issue, and it goes along with what you're saying, the issue is that you have passionate people on the two ends of the spectrum. But the mass in the middle is not passionate and not concerned enough until they feel the pain. The problem is they haven't heard what that pain is going to be if they're not careful. Gene was right with regard to if they don't change the tax issue, $2.5 billion within a 5 to 6 year time frame is going to be horrendous. And yes, we will see property taxes go through the ceiling because the other taxes are being cut. If you cut the taxes, the income taxes from the upper echelon, and you have the lower echelon, and I'm not talking about Romney's 47%, but you have the
walk
lower,
down that road.
the lower echelon of people who don't pay a lot of taxes because they don't have a lot of income.
Right.
So who gets
Plus
hit?
I
It's
think the
that
food
middle
stamp
group.
exemption, you know, weren't there some other cuts for lower income taxpayers in the package?
And they
Talk
will
about that a
feel
bit.
it.
Yeah.
When you see food stamps cut, when you see Medicare being addressed, I don't think a lot of people really understand that whole Medicaid, Medicare issue on either end, whether they're concerned about Obamacare or whether they're going
Right.
to see what happens with the tax cuts. There's some real serious issues that I don't think the general public has felt the pain yet, but if we enact all of the things that have come through the legislature in the last 2 years, there's going to be pain, and it's going to be mainly borne by those in the middle, and it'll be borne by some of the poor people too who lose their programs that are so important.
Yeah. Rob, talk a little bit. By the way, just for the record, we've written about all of this stuff in
I
the
know you have.
newspaper, but you don't get the sense that the public is really Medicare, Medicaid, tax cut, education funding, all of it. You really don't get the sense the public has completely absorbed it. Rob, talk a little bit about what Tim was talking about in turnout. Why, particularly in primaries, it seems like, because I think we're going to have, you would agree, we'll probably have a pretty good
Yes.
turnout in November. We always do in presidential years. But the primaries in August seem particularly unattractive to a lot of voters. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that we've turned elections so negative that you get to people, and it's very much what Tim said, that people aren't real involved until they're prodded by something, whether in what I was saying earlier, the State Board of Education, these other things that are coming, whether they're, and I think that prod will be there in 2012. Or
Do you think it'll be
2014,
there enough to affect the governor's race in 2012? We don't know who the nominee is on the
it depends on how
Democratic
strong a
side.
candidate the Democrats can throw. To be blunt, if they can throw somebody that's as good as a Kathleen Sebelius,
Right.
absolutely, it'll make a difference.
But let's be blunt, the Democrats haven't been able to do that
No,
in some time.
and you know, I don't. And
We'll have Gene talk
yeah,
about
Gene
that in a
probably
minute.
knows more about what's in the wings in those kind of things.
Maybe he's running for governor.
yeah.
Maybe we can make some news here. tonight.
But I think that the negative campaigns, both in the primary and the general, have turned a lot of people off. They don't want to hear all that negative. They want to know, what are you going to do to help
Right.
me?
But they don't really-
And the ads and all the stuff that you just get bombarded with is turning people off, and so they're going away.
Particularly in state races where a lot of the information is in your mailbox and cards. mailers that can't be scrutinized. You don't know whether the claims in those are true. I wrote a couple of months ago that you could have 1,000 reporters working 1,000 years and not address all the claims that are made in those mailers, which are some of the stuff is very egregious. But the other thing you sense in Kansas, and Gene talked about this, is the public in primaries arguably doesn't really think anything is really at stake in some ways. Now this may have been a bit different, but because Republicans are have so much power in Kansas, and the Democrats arguably haven't really put up a resistance, you get the feeling that the public doesn't look at the primary as important as it clearly is, not just in Tim's race, but other races. Do you think that's true too, that they don't really grasp what August is all about?
I think this has been a continuing problem in the primary elections for quite some time, in that the zealots, the motivated people are interested in the primaries.
And their vote counts as much as everyone, let's be clear.
I think we also probably need to look a little bit at the media, the newspapers. Unfortunately, people are not subscribing to the newspaper or reading the newspaper the way they used to. They're not getting as informed on, and you've cut back on coverage of Topeka issues, and those things are not getting out to the public as well as they used to even. And then you have the problem with the public just not tuning in.
But
I went door to door, I would go door to door, and I'd always be amazed when I'd go door to door and ask people about, what's the key issue, and they said, well, I haven't really thought about it. They don't think about things until they walk into the voting booth, unfortunately, sometimes.
But I agree, by the way, on all the media discussion, and in fact I've been talking about that for some time, and that's another show, and everyone can come back for that. But also arguably another problem in Kansas is the real split is between the moderate Republicans and the conservative Republicans, and we have registration by party in the state of Kansas. So when you go to the primary, if you are a Democrat, you can't be involved with the Republican primary unless you declare as a Republican at that point, which a lot of Democrats don't want to do. And so the Democrats in essence say, I have no dog in the fight, I'll vote for the Democratic nominee, and that hurts moderates like Tim Owens. I mean, clearly that's one of the dynamics at play, that a lot of voters who might have supported you didn't vote in the primary because they didn't have a chance. So is that right? And the corollary to that quickly is, why don't you just declare as a Democrat? I mean, so we would get a viable two-party discussion going in this community rather than one party sort of arguing with itself.
Well, of course, there are a lot of facets to that, but the
I asked multifaceted questions.
The reality is that, one, I'm a Republican, have been my entire life. Started out as a Rockefeller Republican in college and have been all that time. There are Republicans who have coined this phrase rhino, and they've called me that on numerous occasions, and they're, certainly have a right to their opinion. But the reality is that in this last election, there were some 6,000 Democrats who switched parties in order to vote for moderate
Countywide
Republicans.
or statewide?
Statewide.
Statewide.
And
that's not a huge number statewide.
It's not a huge number statewide, but it's significant when you think about the people that actually went forward and did it for the very reasons that you're talking about, because they support moderate candidates. And they knew that if they didn't get moderate candidates in many of those races, that certainly they weren't going to have an opportunity later on in the general election. So I think that we've seen more of that discussion going on. I don't foresee the ability of having, with all due respect to the Libertarian Party, certainly I don't see another party being successful yet. It's been discussed many times. I'm not sure that maybe an independent might have some say. There's one state that has an independent governor, and that's Rhode Island. But I think there are a lot of people.
Soon have an independent senator as well, so a little of that is growing.
But I think that there are a lot of people that are really disenchanted with both parties. They're disenchanted with the whole idea that I agree, the anger and the hate that's out there. People just kind of, it's like being poked with a cattle prod. They just, you know,
Right.
pull back.
Plus you couple that with this idea that nothing's at stake and you can understand lower turnouts. Now, Rob, let me ask you this. There are prescriptions in terms of how we vote that could change this. Open primaries. Missouri, for example, you don't register as a party. You pick one ballot or the other, but it's not permanently recorded. So if you want to cross over, you can relatively easily. Again, some states have gone to completely open primaries. The top 2 vote getters, regardless of party, go on to the general, or at least they're discussing that. Any formulaic way that we can make elections better in your view, or is it much more about media involvement, convincing people something's at stake?
I don't think there's a formula per se that would make that big a difference. I think there's a couple things that could help in Kansas specifically with the minor party situation, because I'm not involved in the primary either. And I think if you look at the voter rolls, the Republican Party's lost a lot of voters. The Democratic Party's lost voters. The Libertarian Party's grown, but when you look at what's happening in Kansas, unaffiliated is the group. If that was a party, would be by far the fastest growing. Well, they can't vote in the primary either.
Right.
And that's a solid third of the electorate.
Just so we're clear, I'm quite familiar with that because I register as an unaffiliated
Right.
or independent as well because of what I do. And people ask me all the time, well, who are you going to vote for in the primary? And I explain, A, I can't vote in the primary unless I pick a party. And B, people, I think I've often argued, misunderstand what primaries are. They are mechanisms for parties to pick nominees. They're
Right.
not elections as you and I understand them. Frankly, I've argued for years that the party should pay for the damn primary because it's for
Absolutely
them.
agree with that.
It's for them
Absolutely.
to pick nominees, and then we all get to decide in November. Gene, can you talk
Well,
about
I
that a
just
little
wanted
bit?
to say, I believe the Democratic primaries, unaffiliateds can vote in the Democratic primaries, not in the Republican.
But I think
primary.
you do, if you do that,
You have
and
to
again,
declare.
correct me if you have to declare as a Democrat
I
when you
think
do
that's
that.
true, but
and then you can come
do
back
it,
out and
but you can't do
undeclare.
it in the
Right.
Republican side. You
But
have to
mechanisms
re-register.
aside, what Rob is saying is that a lot of people don't identify with either party, and they see this intramural fight in the Republican Party and think they don't have anything at stake. 2 out of 3 voters don't get involved, and so you do leave it sort of to the committed voters, as Tim suggests. Again, am I missing something there? Is that
No, I think
that's
that's
what's
true.
happening.
I do want to say, are we going to discuss the election
Yes.
process itself?
Yes.
Because there's some things I wanted to mention about that I think are pretty important for
Well,
people
we'll
to know.
take us there then before we come back to
Okay,
because I
wanted
want
to
to talk about judges.
One
too,
thing that I found out recently from our election commissioner, Brian Newby,
who does a great job, by the way.
is the fact that the number of polling places have been reduced by 20%, even though the number of the voting population is increasing by 10%.
In November now, so we're
Yes.
clear, in November.
So
yes.
this is a problem.
And why?
That's a very good question.
Save money?
I guess that would be at least the cover story.
Right.
I think that Brian
Statewide,
Newby
by the way,
is,
or just Johnson County, based on what he's told?
I think that's statewide.
Right.
Brian Newby, but I learned it from Brian Newby, so
Right.
it could be possibly Johnson County. But Brian Newby says we must have 50% vote by mail, or there are going to be long lines at the polls. And another thing a lot of people don't understand about the presidential election years, at least in Johnson County, is that the polling places open at 6 a.m., not 7 a.m. So if you need to go to work, you can go early. And of course, we do have the early voting
Right.
beginning on the October 22nd, so people can vote early in person at places like Metcalf South and some of those places. But I think people really need to be focused on these types of additional ways to vote to alleviate these long lines, because once you get the long lines on election day, a lot of people will be discouraged, especially the people that have jobs, I'm going to be late to work if I don't leave, and things like that.
Right.
So I would like to
and
encourage...
talk about the photo ID thing as well.
The photo ID will probably slow the process down. I voted in the primary using the photo ID, and I voted at Metcalf South. I early voted down there at Metcalf South. And it was very cumbersome, took a long time.
Some people didn't know about the requirement,
Yeah, the people
presumably.
didn't know. Hopefully the training process has alleviated some of that. But I would expect there to be delays on November 6th.
Yeah, unless there's some early voting and some other things.
Yeah, so
Are you
vote
worried
by
about this
mail.
as well, Rob?
Well, I think that the long lines aren't going to be quite as much. I think, and I worked with Brian in our study group that we did in 2009 about voting. I think that he's done a very good job with what he's been given in the situation. I think what's going to happen is if you look at the statistics over the last multiple elections here, advance voting has increased dramatically. In 2008, the advance vote was 35% of the vote. Brian's saying to Gene that we need 50% or the lines are going to be long. He may get his 50% with the advance vote. That has become a big deal for those of us with teenagers and you know, you're chasing your kids and you're doing all the things that you do in life. That advance voting is a big deal. So I think he may get his 50% in that regard.
I want to come back to the sort of the nuts and bolts of voting, but there is some suggestion, and I'm not sure I agree with it, but let's just talk about it, that the Secretary of State has been involved in some effort to shrink the vote. Through these regulations, through voter ID, we're talking about Chris Kobach, of course. Do you think that's true, Tim? Do you think that there's a concerted effort to depress turnout in Kansas? And if so, really why? I mean, if you're doing it on the national level, I don't think anyone doubts that Mitt Romney is going to carry Kansas, so why would you try to depress the vote? But maybe you don't think that's even going on.
Well, my crystal ball probably isn't any better than anybody else's,
And
but
let
I
me
can
just
only say that
he's not here, so I don't
No.
want to get too aggressive about it, but that suggestion has been made.
Well, I know Chris. I sat next to him for 2 years on the city council in Overland Park, and I know what his passions are as far as trying to, I really think there is a very strong passion to make this state 100% Republican if we can. And we heard that straight from the governor when he was trying to get the votes in the Senate. He didn't want Democrat votes. He wanted all Republican votes on issues that were important to him.
Right.
I think Chris Kobach is in that same ilk, and I think that it would not surprise me to know that he was trying to do everything he possibly could to make sure that there was a strength in getting the Republican vote out in order to take it over. You know, the reality is when you look at the numbers and you look at, you've got a red state, you've got a very strong majority in the legislature in both houses, you have a Republican governor, you have strong Republicans in most of the counties. It seems to me a little bit unnecessary for them to do that. Why would they do that? Now, I suppose
Maybe they aren't doing it. I mean, maybe it's
Well,
just sort of a, I mean, and Gene, talk about this a little bit. I mean, I think there are some, you get some sense that people are a little more paranoid about depressing the turnout than maybe is warranted. And you hear all the time, hey, what's wrong with the voter ID? I have to use an ID to rent a movie or whatever. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think that's that's true for many of us.
Right.
But some people, an elderly person that doesn't drive anymore, they have to get a
It is onerous
photo
for some
ID.
people, no question about it.
Yeah, it's difficult, and it'll be more difficult when you go to the birth certificate
Right.
issue. But I do want to say, I think we should not be reducing the number of polling places when the voting population is increasing. If it's a matter of cost, I think we owe that to ourselves to spend that money to protect this almost sacred right that we have here to vote.
Yeah,
And, I won my first election by 2 votes, so I can
votes
believe
matter.
me. I know how important it is.
And I think this is a fascinating topic, frankly, because you'll hear people make the argument you just made, which is whatever it takes to protect the franchise we should spend. But spending on elections is unique. I've compared it at times to snow removal, which is no one wants to spend on snow removal until it snows. And then, by God, spend every nickel you can. And voting is the same thing. We could double the number of polling places, but since we only vote once or twice a year, that's kind of a sunk cost. Talk about that a little bit, that it isn't like road repair or police service or fire service, which is a day in, day out need. You only need voting
Well,
spending when you vote, then it's the most important thing going, right?
Well, they changed the polling places. I mean, they don't always have
right.
a fixed set
well, I'm just
of
talking
polling
about,
places.
you talked about how much we spend on polling places. And
Well,
and
I'm
what-
saying that maybe that is
Yeah.
the reason they are saying
Yeah.
they're
You-
going to reduce the
having talked to Brian and others involved, one of the problems is getting poll workers. I mean, just getting people to help.
Well, that's-
and you know, that's a long day, new technology. People are kind of crappy at times. It's November. It's a Tuesday. It's chilly. You know, elderly people do it, and maybe it's a bit onerous for them, Rob. I mean, the way we vote is very strange, isn't it?
Sometimes, yeah, absolutely. I think that where Gene's going with the growth of voters, though, is that growth is with the younger crowd, you know, the 35 and under, a crowd that is very technologically advanced.
Yes, they are.
They want technology. They don't want to have to go to a polling place per se. They want, and I understand all the ramifications of what I'm about to say, they would prefer an iPhone app that they could vote on and move on with their day. And those kind of things. Now, that's part of the discussion we had, and Chris Kobach was part of this group as well as me, that we talked about. We talked about a lot of different ways that you can vote and try to increase voting. Mail only. Computers, all these kind of things that are out there today. The biggest challenge is that the easier you make it to vote, the easier it is to game the system, so that security is an issue. That was one of Chris Kobach's biggest things in the study group, was that whole security thing,
right.
And that's where I think the voter IDs come from. I'm not a big fan of that voter ID situation either. I think it was overkill.
Right.
I don't think it was needed. The voting anomalies in Kansas were minute. It was overkill. It was complete overkill.
But let's be clear. You're right that there are security issues, arguably, with voting by phone or by computer. Even mail-in ballots, absentee. There have been some stories recently that absentee ballots have a failure rate about twice of normal voting. But there are things we could do that are very low cost, frankly, and very low tech that could increase participation. Vote on Saturday. You know, open the polls on Saturday, or keep them open for 24 hours so that people who work during the day could vote in the evening, or in shifts, or declare a national holiday. Some people have suggested that. You know, we don't pursue any of those, do we, Gene? I mean, we don't do those remedies
we have early
either.
voting here,
Right.
and we have voting by mail, which is certainly steps in the right direction. But I don't know. It'll be very interesting if people choose not to vote by mail. As Brian Newby says, he needs, I think, 50%, which has been the case, I believe, in the past. We could have a problem. And if we have a problem, that's going to discourage, if we have long lines, it's definitely going to discourage
I don't
voting.
disagree with that, although I will say I voted in Kansas in general elections for decades, and long lines in presidential years are almost a given. Whether, no matter how many polling places you have, you stand in line, and it can be kind of an enjoyable experience. At least it's been in my experience. Tim, do you think there are other things the state could do to encourage more people to participate in general elections, not primaries as we were discussing earlier?
Well, I really think some of the suggestions you've made are things. Let's face it, we're a society that has changed a lot of our holidays so that they make for 3-day weekends. They used to be whenever they fell. And so people want convenience. They want to make it convenient. You know, Gene's comment about doing, or your comment on Saturday, maybe a way to make it more convenient for people.
I'll tell you, just to interrupt you quickly, where I get kind of frustrated is media, particularly when I was in television, are always criticized for exit poll information that is released before the polls close everywhere in the United States, where you get the projection in Indiana before California closes, or Florida, or whatever. But there's such an easy way to solve that without infringing on the First Amendment, and that is have common opening and closing times for the polls across the entire country, so that all the polls open at the same time and close at the same time, and all you would need to do is extend the day so that, in essence, it goes from 4 a.m. to whatever. And yet we seem to ignore the low-tech, the easy answers, and wring our hands about, no, the polls and nobody turns out. I mean, sometimes that maybe is true about a lot of our politics, right?
Change is hard, and we're a bit of a traditional society. We don't want to change a lot of things, but there are other things that we will change. And it may be that the time has come where we really need to examine that. But each state does it on their own, in their own different ways, and it's a very independent states' rights kind of an issue.
Not only that, by county and jurisdiction by jurisdiction. But here's your chance, fellas. Urge people to vote, Gene. To tell them why they should.
Well, I just can't. First of all, I've often thought, if you don't vote, you are still voting. You're voting for whatever is decided by other people. So the question is, are you going to vote that way by not voting, or are you going to vote by making a conscious effort to figure out and weigh the issues and weigh the candidates' positions and then vote? And I think it's critical because it's going to affect your lives. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't understand that the down ballot races, like the state races, and really affect their lives more than the national races. So people need to pay attention to the down ballot races, and they need to vote in those down ballot races. A lot of people only vote for the presidential position, and then they don't bother to go down the ballot and vote for the other people.
And we should make clear that there are numerous places where people can go online and find out which district they're in, who the candidates are.
Sample ballots they can get off JoCo election.
Who the candidates are, a little Googling around or search engineering around, you can find out all the information you need to make a good decision. You think that's true, Rob, that that there is plenty of places for people to go to get
absolutely.
this
And Brian Newby's done a wonderful job here in Johnson County. Absolutely. To get that information out there. If you need it, it's easy to get. I mean, even the Facebook group for the Johnson County election office is extremely, I've posted questions out there at times, and then I've got answers immediately. That kind of thing. I agree with Gene. If you take the old Rush, kind of some lyrics from the old Rush song, you know, choosing not to make a decision, you've still made a decision. And that's exactly what and I agree with Gene exactly in that regard. We need to vote. And even if you don't, I don't fall into the trap, and I call it a trap, of the voting for the lesser of two evils. Because that's what it seems like the election's turned into today, is that I'm not voting for Mitt Romney, I'm voting against Obama.
Yeah.
Really? Why aren't we voting for who we want instead? Because at that point, then you can make your point. And how I can kind of, there's two examples that I would like to use. And if you go back and look at the Ross Perot situation years ago, in 18% of the vote in Kansas, it was closer to 24, 25.
It was huge.
It was huge in Kansas.
It was one of his top states in the country.
What happened then? Well, the next 8 years, even though we had a Democrat and Republican, following that whole situation in office, his big issue was the balance the budget.
Yeah, deficit.
Well, the next 8 years, Congress did a fair job, actually. He lost the race, but he won on his issue, because they did, all of a sudden, 25% of Kansas wants a balanced budget.
Right.
Okay, that makes a statement, and that's where I find voting outside the two big parties. I know I voted in every single election I could since I was 18. I've never ever voted for a Republican or a Democrat for president, ever. I believe that you make that statement rather than not voting.
Right. Let me just, before we go further, forgive the Rush reference. If you're under the age of 40, we'll work on other bands for the next time we get together. But you could make a case, couldn't you, Rob, that, and Gene, maybe you want to weigh in on this too, that the smarter vote, if you're going to skip a vote, is the presidential race, particularly in Kansas. You don't want to ever leave a name out, but the Kansas outcome at the presidential level may be already determined. It's those down ballot races where your life is really changed. And I tell this to younger voters all the time: the tuition you pay at this community college, the availability of books, transportation, how much teachers are paid, how many students are in your classroom. That's all determined on those races that are on page 2 of your ballot. And I think that's forgotten sometimes in the excitement over the presidential race.
And Tim alluded to the fact that in the Senate, which has served as kind of a check on some of the more radical ideas and proposals, if that balance is not, if we don't have at least 14 people in the Senate, which will make it impossible to get a 2/3 majority,
For veto purposes.
there are
Veto
going to
override.
be significant constitutional amendments that will affect everyone in Kansas in a significant way. And one thing a lot of people may not understand is that although you need a 2/3 majority to pass a constitutional amendment in the House and the Senate of the state, you only need a 51% vote
50%
of the
plus one,
public.
right.
Yeah.
Simple
So
majority.
basically, if those constitutional amendments get put on the ballot, they can pass with 50 plus 1%, and things such, and Tim mentioned the things like the voting for judges.
We're going to come back to
Yeah,
that.
okay.
It's a beautiful
Those are three
segue.
issues that are really, there's at least 3 or 4 key issues
Well, let's
that will change forever
Right.
what it's been like to be a resident of Kansas.
And we should talk about the judges because, again, I was at this Bar Association meeting. Lawyers and judges are particularly concerned. But you can hear people on the other side who have argued in Missouri and will argue in Kansas that the way we pick judges now is undemocratic, small d democratic, because we leave it in the hands of quote-unquote experts, and that we have diminished the role of elected officials, or for that matter, the public, because you do hear chatter in Kansas and Missouri about direct election, particularly of appeals court judges, obviously, and the Supreme Court judges, even though we do some direct election in some counties, as you know. Well, tell us why, if, Tim, you're concerned about this idea of moving from a selection of judges to a broader election of judges. Why
Well,
should we be worried, or should we?
I'm not sure that I agree with your wording. It isn't
Fire
one
away.
of the other. The proposal that the governor has is that he nominate a person that he wants to be a judge, and that person then would be confirmed by the Senate. A heavy Senate Republican Party would
Let's back up a little bit. You would need to change the Constitution to do that.
only for the Supreme
For
Court.
the Supreme Court.
The Court of Appeals is the one that's being addressed first because it's a statutory change and
Right.
does not require a vote of the people. It doesn't require a change in the Constitution. However, it's viewed as a step toward a change in the Constitution. Now,
For the Supreme Court justices.
That's right. And the numbers that
in
Gene
Kansas.
was talking about, the number 14 is the magic number in the Senate. If you have 14 votes like we have had up to now, we had probably more like 16 votes, 15, 16 votes, where we could keep that from happening and keep the current system in
Right.
place.
Which you support.
I support it very strongly
Why?
because it is addressing, you have 4 members of the commission that are appointed by the governor and 5 members that are elected by the bar. The people that appear before the judges, the people that are involved in the courts, those are the people that are elected by the bar, and they're elected across the state in a geographically dispersed way. And that has worked very well, and they nominate 3 people to the governor. The governor can select one of those 3, or he can reject them all and send them back for another selection.
Right.
But nevertheless, the governor does not like that because he thinks that he should be able to pick who he wants to be now, that happens to be the current governor. It would be any governor in the future that would be there.
Right.
You know, I
and there's
doubt-
some discussion, again, of doing this in Missouri.
But I do
Right.
want to say further that merit selection of our judiciary is critical. We're selecting people that are meritoriously designed to be there. We have a panel that looks at them and says these people are the best candidates that we can do this with. And absent that, it's political. It's all political. And if we have that happen in this state, we will have lost the judiciary to the political arena completely.
But other states elect their judges.
Well, they may,
I mean,
but
it
that doesn't mean they're right.
Right. But it doesn't mean that Kansas would be wrong necessarily for doing it, Tim, other than just sort of theoretically wrong.
If we were to go to a system of electing the judges completely, then I might agree with you. That is another way where the people would have the absolute say, but not one person. But when the governor can appoint,
Well,
even
you
though
would
the
need
governor's
Senate
elected,
approval, let's be fair, so you, Well,
Senate approval, I was on
But the
I
people
was on-
elect senators, and let
Sure
me
they
come back
do.
to this in a minute, because let's back up a little bit. If this change is to come, Gene, you would have to present the at the Supreme Court level to the voters of the state of Kansas. They would have the ultimate say, not the Senate, right? I mean, so what would be wrong with that system? I mean, why not, change the way we pick our judges through a referendum of the people as opposed to the Senate itself?
You mean to change the Constitution?
Yes, to allow this.
By 50 plus
Right.
1%.
What's wrong with that?
Well,
I mean, that's the check on the Senate, liberal or conservative, right?
Well, I think that, that sounds like it's a viable argument. However, we all know that with the money involved in these kinds of campaigns, when a lot of money is poured into a campaign to make a certain thing happen, it's pretty likely that it will happen. And with only 50 plus 1%, the chances are greatly increased. And I think so I think that's the danger of it. And the more that you have politics injected into the judicial decisions, the more likely they are to be political decisions rather than actual judicial decisions about the viability and constitutionality of the law.
I will invite myself back for this debate if it becomes a debate, but do you share that view, Rob?
Well,
because the other argument you hear is that judges should be more allied with the political system because they make political decisions all the time and then are insulated in some way from the voters, although there are retention votes and other things. So
I don't
talk a
think
little.
there's ever been a retention vote that actually stopped somebody.
Right. Some states have had that, though.
Well, I don't think in Kansas necessarily. I think there's some middle ground here because I agree. I think the current system is flawed. With the lawyers being able to, the group that we don't, as a voter, get a chance to really have a say at all. I'm not thrilled with the idea. I don't know the answer here. I'm not thrilled with the idea of turning it loose to just open elections. All of us have run campaigns. We know the kind of money it takes. If you're out there begging for money to run as a judge, how does that affect your decisions? And I understand the ramifications of that as well. I'm not sure what the answer really is in this specific topic.
But you don't doubt, do you, that this will be the central issue of the next legislative session? Because
I think it'll be
Tim
one of
is
them,
right.
absolutely.
I mean, they've sort of asked and answered the tax question, although there may be an attempt to revisit that, although you would guess that would not be likely. But judges are clearly, the pressure point, if you will, in 2013.
It's definitely been one of the issues that the conservative Republicans have been slow boiling out here.
In part because of school finance, and we've got about 5 minutes
Exactly.
left, and I think that's what, Gene,
Well,
when you talk
I
about
just-
that, and then Tim.
I just wanted to say, yeah, that's another of the three key issues, the suitability clause in the state constitution regarding
Right.
finance for education. And if that is removed, and the definition of suitability then becomes whatever the legislature
Right.
wants to make it. And also we have the personhood amendment, which would affect, if that is put in there, then that means that there will be no, basically abortion will be completely illegal.
Tim.
Yeah, I really believe that, I think that one of the reasons I was defeated was because of the concerted effort about the judicial issue and the selection.
You think the governor is really committed, and the people behind the governor is really committed to changing the judge thing?
I was in the governor's office 4 times with him urging me to do that. And I just disagreed with him. But I think that
Do you
is
think
one.
I'm right that it's based basically on school the tax thing doesn't
Yeah.
work
It goes
unless you
back-
figure out school finance, and school finance doesn't work unless you change the judges.
It
At least
goes
that's the
back-
argument you'll hear.
I think it goes back to the Montoy decision back in 2001.
Let's be clear what that is. That
That was
basically
the school finance bill.
and talked about equality and education opportunity across the
That's
state.
right, and I think there were people that were angry. They're still angry about that. And that was driving a lot of the whole concept of activist judges and those sorts of things. And that has all been, I think you're right in bringing those things together, that they all played into each other. But yeah, I think that's where we are, and I agree with Gene, I really think that we are going to make a big mistake if we allow for that judiciary to be controlled by the political machine.
We've got about 3 minutes left. Let's go around the table, about a minute for each of you. Rob, we'll start with you. We hear all the time that this is the most important election of a lifetime. And I don't want to get into the specifics of who's running, who isn't, but could you talk for a minute about how important this election is in your view?
Well, I think
and we'll have the other gentleman talk about
okay.
it too.
Well, I think it's very important to all of us. Again, what I mentioned earlier, we need to make a statement. We need to let our elected representatives know, how do I feel? How do you really feel? Because that's the only way they can do their job properly, in my opinion. They can't build a consensus without that knowledge of, okay, yeah, the voters really would like to see this versus that. And so you need to vote. In my case, yes, I tend to vote third party because I think it makes a statement that I want to make. I vote for somebody, I don't vote against somebody. And I think that's a big, big, big deal.
All right, great. Gene?
Well, I would just say that the reason I think this election is so critical, and I agree that it's overused sometimes, that this is the most important election ever. But
hear about
in
that
this
about every
case,
90 days.
Kansas is on the brink of a complete kind of sea change in control and lack of balance because of the power of the governor and having complete control of both houses in the legislature and potentially the judiciary. That would greatly change the whole way that we in Kansas are used to living and thinking about the things that government does. So I think that's why it is a particularly critical election.
All right, great. And then Tim, finally.
I think it's critical nationally, but also for Kansas for the reasons stated. But I think if the people in the 60 to 80% middle do not get passionate about government and about what affects them, they're going to allow the extremists to determine. It isn't the majority, it's the extreme ends who are making a decision as to who is going to control our lives in elected office. That's what's so important. Is it the most important election that we've ever had? I can't say that. I've lived a long time, been through a lot of elections. But I think it's critical, and we've got some very dire issues here in Kansas that need to be dealt with. People can only change that if they go vote.
Okay, Tim, Gene, Rob, thanks. One of my favorite sayings growing up came from Abby Hoffman, the old 60s radical, who once said, "There is no such thing as an innocent bystander. If you are a bystander, you are not innocent." And I believe that. I believe that there is no room in our community for bystanders. So on November 6th or before that, if you can, be sure and get out and cast your ballot. Again, thanks to the three gentlemen here, and thanks to you for your attention here this evening. Once again, JoCo in the Know, sponsored by Johnson County Community College and the League of Women Voters. I'm Dave Helling reporting. Thanks.